Surprises According to Humphrey by Betty G. Burney. Chapter 4. Spring Fever. Wait for the bell, Garth. Mrs. Brisbane's words jolted me from my nap. Garth always jumped out of his chair just before the bell rang for recess, lunch, or the end of the day. When Mrs. Brisbane reminded him, he sat back down until the bell actually rang. Now you may go, class, Mrs. Brisbane said. Once the room was empty, she shuffled the papers on her desk. Then the door opened and in came Principal Morales. Got a second, Sue? He asked. Of course, Mrs. Brisbane greeted him. What can I do for you? Ruth Wright put in a complaint. It's about, Mrs. Brisbane finished his sentence. Humphrey? The principal smiled. Yeah, just try to keep him in the classroom. I intend to, said Mrs. Brisbane. Don't worry, Mr. Morales chuckled. She's always complaining about the squeaky door in the cafeteria, some fingerprints on the trophy case, and the fact that the clocks are running 30 seconds slow. Well, she teaches PE. I guess rules are very important to her. Mr. Morales strolled over to my cage. So, Humphrey, had a little adventure today. Maybe he has spring fever, he said. I think the whole class does, Mrs. Brisbane answered. It happens every year. The weather turns nice and the class gets silly. The principal leaned in close to my cage. Well, no more silliness from you, Humphrey. You stay put. I will try because Mrs. Wright is mean, 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 I squeaked. Mr. Morales chuckled. Aw, don't let it bother you, Humphrey. Mrs. Wright likes to complain. Then he turned back to Mrs. Brisbane. Don't forget, deadline's coming up, Sue. Sorry I forgot. I'll write myself a note. Mr. Morales smiled. Great. The bell rang again, and the principal excused himself. In seconds, my classmates came racing back to the room, pink-cheeked, out of breath and smiling. At least most of them were smiling. Good game, Tabby, Seth told Tabitha. We almost won. Yeah, we would have if it wasn't for you-know-who, she answered. Then she glanced at Garth, who was right behind her. He definitely wasn't smiling. Take your seats, children, Mrs. Brisbane said. Get out your social studies books and turn to page 112. Sometimes being a classroom hamster is like being a detective. You hear bits of conversations and try to figure out what's going on. Like, what was that about Mrs. Brisbane forgetting something Mr. Morales wanted? She never forgets anything. And why did Tabitha say, you know who, instead of Garth's name? And why wasn't Garth happy like everybody else? I was sorting out my thoughts when something even more puzzling happened. Rather than reading his social studies book, Garth was writing something in big letters on a piece of paper. But I couldn't see what he wrote. He kept the paper on his desk and read the book, but he stopped to look at the paper once in a while. Then he wrote another word next to it. I climbed up my ladder to see if I could get a better look at it. Og? I squeaked softly. Can you see what Garth wrote on the paper? I heard some gentle splashing, but no answer. Mrs. Brisbane started writing questions on the board, and soon my friends were busily writing the answers. This went on until the lunch bell rang. My classmates all got up and headed for the door. Garth pushed forward, clutching the paper in his hand. He paused near AJ's desk and dropped the paper in front of his friend, then hurried towards the door. AJ stared at the piece of paper, crumpled it up into a ball, and dropped it on the floor. Uh-oh, Aldo wouldn't like that. When Mrs. Brisbane got ready to leave for lunch, she spotted the paper on the floor, picked it up, and smoothed it out. She frowned when she read it, and then she put it on her desk and left the room. Something is unsqueakably wrong between Garth and AJ, I told Og. I've got to know what that paper says. It's a long, long, long way from the table to where Og and I live to Mrs. Brisbane's desk. And it's a hard journey. But once I'm curious about something, I can't get it out of my furry hamster head. Keep a lookout, Augie, okay? I told my friend. I'm going over there. He answered with a reassuring boing. I pushed out on the lock that doesn't lock, and the door swung open. I took a deep breath, and as I had done before, grabbed onto the leg of the table and slid down so fast I could feel the breeze ruffling my fur. I zigzagged across the room, happy to be outside the ball, since I didn't have to worry about bouncing off tables or chairs. I quickly reached Mrs. Brisbane's desk at the opposite side of the room. I can't tell you how tall it looks from a hamster's point of view. Between the chair legs were two horizontal wooden bars. I reached up, grabbed the lowest bar, and slowly pulled myself up. Are you watching the clock, Og? I squeaked. Boing, Og answered. Grabbing the next bar, I used all my strength to pull myself up. I was getting tired, but knowing that lunch didn't last for very long, I wrapped my legs around the chair leg and slowly inched my way up to the seat. I sat there for a few seconds, trying to catch my breath. I was still a long way from the desktop and that piece of paper. Above my head, there was a desk drawer with a handle on it. I had to leap up to grab a hold of it. Ooh, cold and slippery. And then I reached up for the edge of the desk and pulled myself up again, finally flinging my whole body onto the surface of the desk. I lay there on my stomach, muscles quivering from all that work. It's a good thing I work out every day on my wheel and my ladder. It helps strengthen my arms, or my legs, or whatever. Boing, boing, said Og. And I didn't need to look at the clock to know I needed to hurry things along. I sat up and saw the piece of paper laid out neatly before me. Of course, to my small eyes, the letters were huge. I had to squint and strain to finally make out what it said. Dirty rat. That was it? I'd come all this way to put myself in great danger to read the words dirty rat? I had no idea what Garth was getting at, although I knew that being called a rat, which sometimes happens to me, is not supposed to be a compliment. Og began splashing wildly. I glanced up at the clock and I barely had time to get back. I had to take the quickest, though not the safest, route back. So I slid down the side of the desk, landed on the floor with a huge thump, raced across the room, and grabbed onto the cord of the blinds, which I always used for swinging myself back up to the table. Boing, 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 boing! Og sounded like a fire alarm, but all I could do was think about getting back to my cage on time. I heard the bell ring as I skidded across the table and swung the cage door behind me. Every muscle in my small body ached. Boing! Og twanged. The paper says dirty rat. I told him, panting from all of my effort. But don't ask me why. All of that work, and I still don't know what is going on. My classmates began to trickle in from lunch. As usual, Miranda was with her best friend Saya, and other best friends were together. Heidi and Gail, Seth and Tabitha, AJ, and whoa! It was very unusual to see AJ without Garth. AJ slid into his seat first. When Garth sat down, AJ leaned over. I strained my small furry ears to hear. What was that about? That dirty rat thing? Garth glared at AJ. Friends don't pick their best friends last. Rats do. You're my friend, AJ protested. You're just not very good at sports. Like, I need you to remind me, muttered Garth. Right then, Mrs. Brisbane started to talk about seed sprouting, and there was no chance to learn more about the trouble between Garth and AJ. Wait after class, Garth, Mrs. Brisbane said when the bell rang at the end of the day. Og, did you hear that? I asked. She didn't say wait for the bell, Garth. She said wait after class, Garth. Og splashed a bit, but I'm pretty sure he heard too. The room emptied out quickly, and soon Garth was alone with Mrs. Brisbane. Being kept after class is never a good thing, at least in my experience. And in my months in room 26, a number of my friends had been kept after school. Mrs. Brisbane went to her desk and picked up the crumpled paper. "Did you write this, Garth?" Garth shrugged. "It looks like you're writing," the teacher continued. "I was just fooling around," answered Garth. "I found it under AJ's desk," Mrs. Brisbane explained. "I thought the two of you were friends." "We're not friends." Garth wrinkled his nose. "Not anymore." Mrs. Brisbane sat down and looked thoughtful. "Would you tell me what happened?" I've got to catch my bus," Garth answered, looking towards the door. "Think about it, and we'll talk about it tomorrow." Mrs. Brisbane folded up the piece of paper and dropped it in her purse. "I'll just hold on to this." Garth raced out of the door without looking back. Mrs. Brisbane stayed sitting in the chair. She stared at the student tables, the bulletin board, the chalkboard. She looked at the room as if she'd never seen it before. After a while, she picked up her books and her purse and came over to adjust the blinds. "I hope you two can get along for the rest of the night," she told Og and me. "We'll try, I assured her, and I meant it. Og didn't say anything, but I don't think he was mad at me or anything like that. Maybe he just had spring fever." Rat. A perfectly nice rodent with a bad reputation. Some rats make nice pets. There are rats of all shapes and sizes, but when one human calls another human a rat, it's never meant as a compliment. Humphrey's Dictionary of Wonderful Words.